Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Jessica Waybright, and I am one of the owners of Remarque Print Workshop in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And this summer, we've had a beautiful group show called Punching Marshmallows, Rage, Uncertainty, and Fatigue. And this is the latest in our series of artist talks about the exhibit. Today, we're joined by Briar Craig. And if you want to ask questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. And we'll also have a question and answer session at the end. So Briar, take it away.
Hi, thank you. I felt like I should be doing something really cool, like appearing from off screen, like ta-da! But I can't do that. Anyway, thank you. Well, thank you for those of you who are here, and thank you for organizing this, Jessica, and the folks at Remarque. This is great, and it was really nice to be part of the exhibition. And I've been lucky enough to sit in on a couple of the speakers, and that's always a really nice opportunity. I'm talking to you right now from the traditional unceded territory of the Syilx people. It's an indigenous or a Native American group in Canada. Much of Western Canada was never treated, so I like to acknowledge that I'm a guest on basically stolen land of the Syilx Nation. It's also part of one of those things that we do as part of our classes, is to acknowledge where we are, and it's a pretty amazing part of the world. In terms of where I am, I'm about 4 hours west or east of Vancouver, and maybe about an hour and a half north of the Canada-US border. We're in the Okanagan Valley, which is a semi-arid desert where we grow a lot of grapes for wine. This is Canada's Western Canadian wine district. So it's very much like the wine district in Washington State, and it just continues on up. The Okanagan Valley extends down into Washington, and then I think maybe even goes as far as Oregon. Anyway, so let's, we've got a slideshow. Let's maybe take a look at that, and I'll just start talking. And I'm literally just going to respond to the images on the slides. And if anybody has any questions along the way, please don't hesitate to unmute yourself and blurt them out, because I think often it turns a talk into a conversation as opposed to a lecture. And I always like the conversation as opposed to the lecture. I am Briar Craig, I'm a printmaker, woohoo! Okay, let's next slide, please. I teach at the University of British Columbia in Kelowna, British Columbia. It's the secondary campus of the University of British Columbia. The other one's in Vancouver. This is our print studio. It's small, but pretty well appointed. We have litho presses and etching presses. We do four media areas. We can do relief printing, intaglio, lithography on stone, and screen printing. And the screen printing that we do is with ultraviolet cured ink. And many people don't know what that is, so we can go to the next slide. This is an ultraviolet dryer. Basically, you screen print with ink that never dries. When you run it through a dryer like this, it's a conveyor belt, and in this, I'm pointing at it as though you can see me pointing at it, but the center section, the little silo area there, is a light source, and it's shining down on that conveyor belt. So you put prints on face side up, they run through there, and as they pass underneath this incredibly intense ultraviolet light, it dries the ink. The benefit for that, as far as I'm concerned, is that I live in a semi-arid area. It's so dry here that anything water-based dries out instantly in a screen. And because this ink is plastic and doesn't dry until it's been hit with this UV light, you can print and keep very, very fine details open in the screen for the entire run of a layer. We do have a video too that if everyone's interested in seeing it at the end, I'll show. It's 3 minutes, or we'll show. It's 3 minutes, and it shows the evolution, I think 16 or 17 layers in the development of one of my prints. Unfortunately, not the print that's in the show in Punching Marshmallows, but one from a similar vintage. Okay, next slide, please. This is the screen printing room at the University of British Columbia. I am lucky enough as a professor there to use the university's print studio as my own. So these are our vacuum tables. The dryer is virtually where the camera is sitting right now, and unfortunately I didn't have a very good picture of it. So all of our screens and our drying racks. The drying racks are really just holding things. You print, the ink is wet on the paper, you put them in the drying rack and then turn the machine on and run them all through the press, and then they're dry and they can be put away. Next slide, please. This is one of the first ultraviolet cured screen prints that I made. I was going to Queen's University, which is in Kingston, Ontario, where I went as an undergrad. And the professor there, Carl Haywood, brought this, basically discovered this UV technology in Europe as part of industry, where they're printing signs and things like that. And he thought it was the bee's knees. And so he brought it to Queen's University and then invited me in the summertime to come back and try it out to see what I thought. The benefits of it, again, are really, really fine detail, something that screen printing, fine photographic detail, and that's something that screen printing has never really been known for. You know, even the Andy Warhols of the world who were making photographic screen prints, the photographs are quite coarse and quite graphic, and this allows for a lot more fidelity in the image and an incredible range of tone. So I was instantly enthralled with this because I'd always been thinking that screen printing, I struggled for many years between my love of screen printing and my love of the detail you can get in lithography. And screen printing really couldn't quite match up to that. So but I was never really completely convinced I wanted to be a lithographer or work through that medium. And when this came along, suddenly screen printing could do things with the kind of subtlety that litho has always been able to achieve. So I was thrilled. And of course, it's very quick. If you have a number of screens prepared, you can print 10 layers of color in a day, which is something you'd never really be able to do with hand or stone lithography. I chose to put this image in because this was actually a transitional piece that led me to much of the work that I'm doing now. And that was that literally, I've been using National Geographic magazines for years. Literally, most visual arts programs at universities are littered with National Geographic magazines because we use them as collage material for students. We tend to get them donated to us, so we literally have thousands of them kicking around the studio. But I was always most interested in them once they started to get cut up, because you would have, as you're flipping through the magazine, you'd have half of a picture would be missing, but the picture on the following page would be there in place of it, and it would create a weird juxtaposition between the one part of the magazine and another part that shouldn't be seen together. And so these images were really based on appropriating that kind of process, literally just getting the National Geographic magazine and tearing it in half and then flipping back through it until I would find two things that played off each other nicely. I tend to think of them as being quite narrative, and that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for the two parts to speak to each other and create some new storyline. I'm not entirely sure what the storyline is, but it feels like there's one here. It feels like there's some narrative possibilities. But what made this a transitional work is that incidentally, as part of that ripping into a magazine, you would get these little lines of text, and they would be completely random. But it was what I found was when exhibiting these works, I thought these works were entirely about the two juxtaposed images, but viewers would spend a lot of time trying to understand them within the context of the little fragments of words that were there. And along the way, printing those words was really fun. I really enjoyed it. And I've always been sort of somebody that likes words and likes wordplay. So I thought, well, why don't I just feature the words more and get rid of the images, or sort of phase the images out? And so ultimately, that's what I've been doing. And now much of my work now is almost entirely word-based, and in part because I really like words and I really like the shapes of them. I get really excited by how different forms fit together. And I'm not so much interested in the words as something to read easily, but I really like the shapes of things. I see something in chat, so, oh, that's there. Okay, Jessica put it there. Okay, next slide, please. This is another one from that same series. These are now becoming fairly large prints. This is roughly 30 by 40 inches. At the time, I didn't have screens large enough to actually print 35, 40 inches. So my collages would have to be made so that they could be easily broken down into two halves. So the tear line that separates the Betty Boop side from the the three women side is a natural break, and I could print the right side of the image exclusively and then the left side of the image butted up against each other and not really create that illusion. But again, it was this series of images, the one with the Santa Claus and then this Betty Boop one, where those little fragments of words really became the focus for a lot of people, and ultimately for me as well. When I print, this image is, I'm guessing this image is around 30 layers of color. And in part, one of the things that I really like about ultraviolet screen printing ink is that it can never be opaque. It can only ever be transparent. And the reason for that is that the ultraviolet light has to be able to penetrate the entire deposit of ink on the surface of the paper and dry it from the bottom up. If you print with opaque ink, it can only dry the top surface of the ink and leave what's underneath that surface wet. And so you end up with prints that kind of rot eventually, because there's a skin of dry ink with wet ink underneath it. And because it only dries with light, doesn't dry with time or with air or anything like that, the stuff underneath would never dry, and it would just start sort of oozing a kind of a weird oily thing. So getting back to the idea of transparency, is that I print with lots and lots of layers because I really want there to be as much vibrancy in the colors as possible. So the red on the Betty Boop character's clothing is probably 8, maybe 10 layers of yellows and reds. And they all very, very transparently pile up on top of each other. So you end up with a really thick deposit of ink, but a transparent distribution of color throughout that. So it's almost like looking at color through glass or underwater. You know, you get that sort of weird intensification from the transparency. And I really like that quality. And I think ultimately I was drawn to screen printing and printmaking in general because of its tendency towards transparent layers of ink, because I think in terms of color, I've always thought in terms of layers. I'm not really good at just thinking, oh, I've got to mix up that color blue and print it one time and it's perfect. I tend to look at a color and think, or try to make a color that will become richer and become nicer over time and through layers. So the photographic process, I mean, obviously I'm working with a color separation process, but I'm never just relying on those 4 cyan, magenta, yellow, black layers of ink. That's not nearly enough. If I want a really good red, I want to print that red many, many, many times. So I'm playing with all kinds of different ways to make positives to expose onto a screen to print. Hopefully this is making some sense. And hopefully you can hear me. So that would be really weird. I'm 5 minutes in and I can't hear you. I'm seeing some smiles and some nods. So okay, and a thumbs up. That's great. Okay, next slide, please. This was one of the first prints. This is just a little tiny print. So I've gone from very large to something that's only maybe 3 by 4 inches as an image. And it really was just me with my typewriter typing up something and breaking. It's basically a fortune cookie fortune broken down into a little block of text. So it's not broken down in terms of the words. There is nothing you can't do. It's just broken down so that it doesn't really have the breaks in between the individual words. Partly as a way to get people to struggle a little bit to read what it says. And I like to show this one because there is a little story that goes with it. One of my colleagues, I mean, this says there is nothing you can't do, with one typo which was crossed out in the middle of it. One of my colleagues decided for Valentine's Day one year that he would give this little print to his wife. There's nothing you can't do. I mean, how much nicer a thing could you possibly say to your spouse? But she can't read it. She can't see she can't read this without the proper breaks. She just reads it as the rye snot high. And she can't get past how he would give her something that says the rye snot high for Valentine's Day. And to this day, whenever I see her, I still can't read that damn print. I like it, but I can't read it. But anyway, again, getting back to the beginning, this was my sort of first foray into making an image that was predominantly about the text and not much else. And because I like things, I like objects, I like the collages that are made from the National Geographic magazines, I like the tactility of the torn piece of paper. I can't just use words. I'm also trying to incorporate those words in some way onto one of those tactile surfaces. And so these little bits of found cardboard or found paper, I always have a plastic bag in my pocket because I'm always picking up junk off the street to save, to maybe scan and use later on. Next one, please. This is the point in case. I found a set of flashcards, mathematical flashcards at a garage sale, and they were all old and beaten up. And I don't really like numbers, so I decided I would make my own set of flashcards, but make them with letters. And made a whole set of these things, and literally carried cardboard pieces of these little cards that I made at a little tiny scale around in my pocket. They went through the washing machine a number of times to get them all appropriately wrinkled and bent, and then scanned them and made a series of prints. And this is a series of, there's 6 of these altogether, so that it isn't just about reconfiguring the letters that we can see on this card, but when there's 6 cards lined up, you can reconfigure letters and try to spell out all kinds of things. And that's the kind of game I play. You know, if I see something, a half a sign or a crumpled piece of newspaper where I can't see all of the text, I'll spend a lot of time trying to rearrange the letters or trying to figure out what the text actually might have said. And so I'm trying to present games to the viewer to unravel a little bit. This one actually is 2 words that are there. It's read me. But a lot of people would read this from the E-M-E-R-D-A, emerda, which apparently is a swear word in Portuguese, which was unfortunate, but that's the way it goes. I didn't know that at the time. Next one, please. And this is just another one in that same series. This is the word image broken down into its component parts and scrambled around. So I think I hope it's inviting enough to look at these 5 letters and try to figure out what they might say. And again, as this series spreads out on a wall with 6 of these different images, all the large letters tend to start looking like you can interchange them as well. Okay, next please. This is the easiest one to read because it's almost spelled out correctly. This is haiku. Not quite spelled correctly, but pretty close. And next, please. Ever since I was a little kid, when I was, I think 7, I was looking at dictionaries and I could not understand what the words at the top of the dictionary page were for. I didn't see them at 7 years old as a navigational device, you know, the first word on the page and the last word on the page. I just saw them as a kind of story I didn't understand. So anytime you open up a page in the dictionary, you tend to have 4 words across the 2 pages. The first, and so you understand that. But because I didn't understand them, I didn't understand what that was for. I kind of collected unusual combinations of words and have my entire life. This is one of my favorites, utopian vacuum. So in this case, it was the last U word and the first V word on the same page, as listed at the very top. And I kind of love that chance that every dictionary is going to be different because the distribution of letters and words will be different. Every volume will be different. And I love going through dictionaries looking for these unusual little chance encounters where 2 words are arbitrarily brought together, and that might have some sort of meaning or allude to some sort of meaning. And I don't know that I necessarily understand what utopian vacuum could mean, but it does feel to me like it has some sort of political, social undertone. These are also just old etching plates. I mean, every teaching at a university, there's a wealth of old etching plates kicking around that people have discarded. And I just literally started hammering the letters to the words with a metal stamp into the plates, and then scan the plate to make color separations and then use that as a starting point for printing. Next, please. This is just a piece of tar paper that I did the same hammering thing, but of course, in tar paper, I wasn't hammering a dent into the tar paper. I was literally just pinching some of the tar paper out. So that's why the hole in the P and the hole in the A or the D are all missing. This is also Spanish pavement red, was also a kind of system that I employed while looking through a dictionary to get these random words to flow together. And again, I don't know what this means, but it does feel like it has some kind of meaning. And I don't actually mind the sound of Spanish pavement red or Spanish pavement reed, and which tense you want to work in. And again, I think I can't deny the fact that too, there's a big challenge to trying to print something that looks like a crumpled piece of tar paper through the screen printing process. And that's just, I find that infinitely great fun. Next, please. This is still one of my favorite prints I've ever made, partly because Mother Nation Oath just sounds fantastic. I mean, it feels like some sort of political uprising about to happen. Mother Nation Oath is terrific and completely found. I guess I've always sort of assumed that I'm a better editor than I am an inventor. So my invention really is to go looking for things that already exist and just find different ways of finding those things. And I mean, obviously I collect things off the road, but I also just go looking for, like, create a system, like the first word and the last word on the page in the dictionary becomes a system for me finding words. And you can go through entire books in the dictionary and not find any that really have any resonance. But occasionally, like in this case, the last M word, the first N word, and the first O word on the following section, it just flowed together really nicely for me. Next, please. I also do make monotypes. So these are large. These are roughly 40 by 55 inch plates. And I'm using a vinyl, like vinyl that you might have on the wall of a gallery for an exhibition. I just print it out backwards, adhere it to a plexiglass plate, and then ink up around that roll up with a roller and scratch through it and do all kinds of things through that until I feel like I'm happy with the surfaces that I've made. Then I peel off the vinyl, exposing a clean plate, pop a piece of paper on top of it, and run it through the press. And this is again one of those iambic hyperbole, being one of those things from the dictionary that I really liked. I think a curator once saw a piece like this that he mistook the iambic for lambic, and I guess he's a big beer connoisseur, and he really likes the idea of the lambic hyperbole as well. And again, the hyperbole is broken down so it fits on the page better, but I like that it becomes the word hyper and then this weird word bowl as well, and it takes a little while to figure out what it says. And I like that. I like those little moments where you have to sort of stutter for a little bit and think about what's being said to you. Next one, please. When I started this series of monotypes, I was doing a residency in Halifax, Nova Scotia, on the east coast of Canada. And I was driving around with a colleague of mine and the curator of the contemporary section of the art gallery of Nova Scotia. And she was in the back seat of the car where I couldn't really hear what she was saying, but she was reading signs as we drove by things in the car. And I thought she said cage-free poetry. And it really stuck with me because my partner's a poet. And I thought, well, I'll make some images for Sarah. That'll be really great. She'll really like them. Then cage-free poetry just sounded so weird. Like, what cage-free? Like, what is caged poetry? I mean, none of it could be good. So cage-free poetry got to be a good thing. It turned out that it was cage-free poultry. And I happened to see that sign on my own weeks later when I was walking on the street by myself. But I still preferred cage-free poetry to cage-free poultry. Although cage-free poultry is very good. And literally, as I'm rolling up, this sort of weird ghost that's happening, again, I'm pointing at it, you can see my fingers pointing. But the white letters and then the darker versions of the letters below, that's really just a process of the roller not depositing ink so well over top of the vinyl, and then it depositing it on the plate later on. And it's a happy accident that just sort of occurred. And I made a whole whack of images trying to play off of that happy accident. And of course, it never works. As soon as you think it's going to work a certain way, it doesn't work that way at all. And so sometimes they just become chaos and just mush. But this one in particular worked for me. Next one, please. Again, getting back to the National Geographic, as the words have become more important and the image becomes less important, then the National Geographic magazine has come back in, but more as a title or as a ground on top of which to put words. And in fact, I'm erasing with lacquer thinner on much of the cover so that the words aren't competing with too much imagery. But again, with these, what's the words on the spine that become a kind of signifier for a lot of content. so deserve what you want, and then the things that are shining are visible as topics for this particular issue of the magazine start playing off of that in a really interesting way. And we can't see that right now, but I think there's oh, actually I can't read it either from here. But there is obviously any kind of words on the spine would be read in conjunction with the words that I'm imposing over the front, and hopefully they create some kind of conflict, or they support each other in an interesting way, or confuse in an interesting way, or whatever. And I'm looking for those opportunities to again invite the viewer to play along and to try to unravel things. And in that respect, I can't go too far. Being a university professor, I can't go too far without mentioning some theory stuff, which I don't always necessarily believe in. I thought I started working this way before I knew the theory, but then I've been able to apply the theory afterwards. But Roland Barthes and the whole death of the author, meaning that the viewer or the reader is the creator of the work, and that the intentions of the author become much more secondary to the interpretations of the reader. And I'm trying to make work that plays off of that by inviting us to play along and try to inject our own thoughts and thinking into how we interpret those juxtapositions of words and texts. Next, please. Just the Nike, just do it. I've just changed around to do it just, because I think there's been an awful lot of weird, unjust things happening in the world in the last 15 or 20 years. And just playing with those words, things that would be understandable and immediately recognizable, but then when you switch them around a little bit, makes you think just a little bit differently. These are literally old slate chalkboards from like a sort of children's size slates from the early 1900s that I've taken the frames off and just used them as a vehicle for drawing on and then putting text over top of them. Next, please. Again, one of those slate things, and just sort of playing with smudging letters and smearing chalk on the surface of that slate, partly just to see if I could print it, if that's something that could be conveyed successfully or accurately through screen printing. And I think that's something that I always do, is I'm always testing how far I can push the medium of ultraviolet screen printing to do things that normally screen printing wouldn't be able to do very well. And hope that I've been able to pull that sense of a real smear, the real chalk mush across the surface in a nice way. And I did have this print in a show in Bulgaria, and the owner of the gallery just could not understand how this was a screen print, because he said it's smudged. You don't smudge screen printing. But I'm like, it was the smudged thing that I printed then. So I think it was successful in that respect. Next, please. This one's a little harder to see in the slide, but you might have to tilt your screen a little bit to get the nuances. But this says whitewash privilege, and then underneath it, so not only is it on top of a particular issue of National Geographic magazine with specific things on the spine, but then there's a layer of text underneath, which is all men are created equal, and then whitewash privilege over top. And those are, again, just phrases and terms that are coming to me from news items and from listening to the radio and hearing different articles about different things. And obviously whitewash is a term that we might use in the art world fairly easily, but white privilege is a word is a term that has become quite prevalent in political and social discussions in the last 10 or 15 years. And then the whitewash privilege just sort of throws a monkey wrench into the mix of it. So we have to think about what that might mean a little bit. And of course, when you're standing in front of this, you can't necessarily read the all men are created equal underneath. You do have to kind of really look and almost like try to see past and through the letters to get them to be decipherable. Trying to get you to work a little bit. I think I've always found still images hanging on the wall of a gallery a little bit anticlimactic when I have a show of my own, and that's just, we stand in front of a piece of paper and look at it. I want it to be more interactive somehow. And I've made some fairly interactive works, print related works over the years. But now I'm trying to inject a sense of you have to do some work for these a little bit. Next, please. This is the print that's in the show, in the Punching Marshmallows show, which I have to also say, I applied for it because of the title. It was when I was going through the cafe listings and Punching Marshmallows came up, I was like, oh my God, Punching Marshmallows, that's like the best title ever. So, and then the rage, uncertainty, and fatigue extending from that is also pretty great, but Punching Marshmallows has got my attention instantly. A smatter of fact with, I can't remember what's behind it. I think it says, hear me, see me, believe me, I believe is what it says underneath. And obviously we are in an era where it's pretty hard to tell what to believe and what facts are facts and what facts are fiction. And it's happening all across the world, but I think in particular in North America, in Canadian and American politics, I think the smattering of fact has become a kind of sport. Now, again, I think the layer of text underneath it, hear me, see me, believe me, is intended to be more of a sobering contextualization of what could otherwise be a kind of a punchline. It's a smatter of fact. It's a bit of a pun, and maybe not all that serious on its own, but hopefully with the context of the second layer of text, it becomes more hard-hitting, I hope. Next, please. Post-truth, that's one of my favorite sayings in the last 10 years. And underneath it, it says, will you benefit if you cooperate? I'm also learning how to use Photoshop increasingly. So I scan often a piece of paper, in this case, a piece of black cardboard that has some chalk smeared on it, and then find ways to put text over top of it in Photoshop. And blurring the text and making it feel like it's a little bit smudged has been a bit of a challenge and something that I'm just playing with technically, just to see if I can do it. Next, please. I don't remember what the impetus for this was, but lies can be written in stone. Again, breaking it down so someone might not necessarily be able to get past the word tone at the end. Or lies can, which also seems like a word, but it isn't. Or there's almost something that looks like tennis in there. So I think there's an effort to confuse us a little bit so that when we actually get through the reading and say it says lies can be written in stone, that maybe it means a little more. Much like the things that I've collected over the years, I have this massive collection of fortune cookie fortunes from restaurants. And we tend to crack them open in the restaurant or read them real quickly and leave them on the table and go home. I've always saved them because I think they're kind of interesting and they seem rather prophetic. But when you have to struggle to read them a little more, hopefully I think the content of what's being said is a little more meaningful. Next, please. These are words from 3 sentences in my artist statement. Again, trying to play with the idea of allowing the viewer to inject themselves into what I'm presenting them. It seemed appropriate for me to break my artist statement down into words and word fragments that can be rearranged like fridge magnet poetry, so that a viewer in the gallery, and this is I think 8 feet tall by 16 feet wide. So these fridge magnet poetry pieces are all pretty big. I think they're 9 inches tall each, but it just seems fun to me to allow the viewer to rearrange my words into anything that they would like me to be saying, and it's just as meaningful and just as interesting, and probably way more interesting because of the weirdness of what can happen. This was near the beginning of an exhibition, so it hadn't really been moved around very much. But I like re-edit it all, then see. I think that's fantastic. Interpreting a chance image might mean the author is playing the text. Playing the text. Oh my God, that's terrific stuff. That's like an exhibition title. Next, please. And these are some of the latest works. These are now just a couple months old, I think. And oftentimes in the old days, we used to print out on a laser printer onto a thing called posi paper, which is very thin. It's almost like drafting paper, but that could be used. Ultraviolet light could go through the paper, but it couldn't go through the toner. So you could photographically put these words onto a screen and print them. And I just ended up with reams of these printouts that I wasn't really using anymore. They'd been exposed onto a screen and printed, and then I just kept them. But I started piling them on top of each other so that you can see layers and layers and layers of different things through each other. And then these again, unusual breakdown of fortune cookie fortunes, which I have to admit I've turned into questions as opposed to statements. So I think this was originally you will make a change for the better, and I just turned it into will you make a change for the better? Again, hoping to involve the viewer in a question. And next, please. This piece and the previous piece was also just a challenge. Can I print the illusion of transparency? Can I print the illusion that there's 5 or 6 pieces of paper that you can see varying amounts of clarity through the screen printing process? And I think it's turned out okay. I think it reads that way. Sometimes when people have seen these digitally, they assume they are collages, and of course they're not. They were a collage that was scanned and then translated into screen printing. So they all exist on a single piece of paper as a flat thing. And next. This was just a fantastic piece of paper that I found that was all wrinkled and there'd been water on it. So the lines, the lineation on the paper had started to bleed. And I started putting scribbles over top of it and then injected text into it. And this was around the beginning of the COVID shutdown. And it did feel like we were starting to stop. And I had hoped that maybe start to stop might have other ramifications and not be just applicable to that situation. But that was the impetus for it. And next, please. And next, please. That's all. Next, please. Folks. Sorry, my little comic book reference. Does anyone have any questions? I've been just yakking away here. We do have a video to watch too, but does anyone have any questions?
I have tons of questions, but
okay.
I'll just ask them one at a time as I think of them. When you do separations, how do you decide what to put in the separations? Like you said, the one piece in the punching marshmallows is probably 15 screens.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah.
How do you decide what to separate?
Well, basically I start with, I've scanned something or I've created something in Photoshop and it exists as a file of a certain size. And in Photoshop, there's a fantastic little button called split channels. And it just breaks down the 4 channels of color, so cyan, magenta, yellow, black, into black and white images. So it just takes all the yellow information out and turns it all black. It brings all the cyan information out and turns it all black. So, and it has to be black to be able to expose onto a screen. So you end up with these 4 pieces of film, one that contains only the yellow information and only magenta information and only the cyan information, only the black information. And then that's a starting point. I print with very, very transparent ink. So after the first 4 layers, it's a very, very wishy-washy full color version of the image. And then I make more positives, making each of those colored layers less. I posterize them or make them lighter or increase the contrast and sort of just tinker. And it's at that point, it's typically based on how the print looks after the first 4 layers. So I'm sort of deciding how much of the magenta I want to print again. And at times, to get 16 layers, probably each of those colors has been printed 4 times in varying amounts. And I'm lucky enough, because I own the piece of equipment, that I can just print out positives without them really thinking about the cost. if I thought about the cost, I wouldn't do it. But there are other ways to adjust. There are other ways to adjust the amount of information you're printing, obviously. But that's the simplest and most straightforward. But I'm also tinkering with color. So I start with very, very translucent versions of cyan, magenta, yellow, black. And then I'm starting to print purples and greens and yellows and oranges and reds, not just the pure CMYK colors. And again, it's almost entirely on how the print is evolving, which makes it fun. If it was just mechanical, if it was just a matter of going through the color separation process and boom, boom, 4 layers, it's done, voila, I'd be bored silly. But it is something you can tease a lot of nuances out of an image by tinkering with the color. Did that answer the question at all?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you.
I wish I had a better way to actually show some of the positives, but they wouldn't necessarily have made any sense. But it's I have reams and reams and reams of pieces of film, and eventually they'll be used for something else. But right now they just relate to the specific images. But any more questions?
So Gail is asking in the chat, when you're doing all those colors, how do you register them all? And have you thought about using more / different typefaces?
Yes, typefaces knock me out. The card series with the brown crumpled card series with the big black text letters on them are Garamond, and that was as close as I could match to the original numerical cards that I found. And there's something really sort of beautifully old-fashioned about Garamond that I really liked, and I wanted those cards to feel like they existed from another era, that I wasn't just making them, that these were maybe found things. But I have to say, I still love Helvetica. There's a documentary, a 2.5-hour documentary on Helvetica that is just lovely. I've watched it so many times, and every time I'm just my partner thinks I'm nuts. She's like, it's Helvetica. And you've seen this documentary a million times. Why are you so excited by it? But it's just a beautiful font. Everything just curves just right. It feels good. It is so easy to read. So yes, I would love to play with more typefaces. And I'm we are implementing a letterpress aspect to our printmaking program. And so we're buying more fonts and maybe paying more attention to them. But still, when I come to my work, I still default. I try all kinds of different things, and inevitably end up back at Helvetica or at Arial, which is such a similar typeface. Okay, now how do I register them all? Well, we'll see when on the video. Basically, I have a big, huge vacuum table. How hard would it be to go back to the image of the screen printing studio from the project or from the talk?
Just give me a moment.
It was like image number 3, probably. We might be able to see the basic setup. But basically, I can start talking about it. Basically, I print on a big vacuum table. So when I turn the vacuum table on, the paper that I'm printing on is being sucked down to the table, so it won't stick to the bottom of the screen. On top of the table, I have a big, huge piece of clear acetate taped to it. So it's taped fully on one side and loosely on the other side, so I can flip the Mylar back and forth off of the table surface, but pull it back up to the exact same spot each time. Once I print on the Mylar, I know exactly where the screen is going to deposit a layer of ink on the table surface. So yeah, it's a little hard to see here, but these tables are screen printing tables. They're vacuum tables, so they have a grid of little tiny holes in them that suck the paper down to the surface. And you can see the shiny, clear Mylar or acetate, I guess it's called, the brand name is Duralar, tape down on top of it. And again, I print onto that, and then I can slide my print underneath that and move it around until it lines up. Then suck the paper down, flip the Mylar back, drop the screen and print. It's pretty simple. And I have a pretty good registration system. So once I only have to do that once, and then each piece of paper just gets put onto the same spot on the table that the previous piece of paper had been. And I just use that with little tape bumpers. I create a sharp edged corner on the paper, and along one edge, another sharp edged spot. And I put little tape bumpers so that each piece of paper just bumps into those things, and it's in the exact same spot that the previous piece of paper had been. I could line them up one by one under the Mylar, but it would take way too long because sometimes to get the registration photographically tight, it can take 15 or 20 minutes to get the first piece of paper lined up perfectly underneath the Mylar. And then you suck it down once it's in the right spot, set up your tapes, your tape tab registration system, and then you're way to go, or ready to go. It is, again, one of the reasons I like the UV screen printing ink that doesn't dry is that I don't have to rush with the registration process. I can print on the Mylar, it's gonna stay wet. I can put a piece of paper underneath it and take as much time as I want to line it up, and the screen isn't drying out. I mean, I have spent as much as an hour trying to line up a layer absolutely perfectly, and my ink is still wet in the screen and ready to go. It's great for students too, because they want to make everything just right, and they don't want to make a mistake. Can't make a mistake. And if they can take their time, it takes a lot of pressure off them. Did that answer your question? And was there another part? Yeah, so that registration thing, that's like the best system there could be. I don't know how else to do it, and it can work really well. There's got to be more.
All right, shall we play the video?
Sure, yeah. And I will preface this, and I guess maybe I can talk over this because it's a video without sound. We made the video, and then I put some pre-recorded sound to it, and then went looking for permissions to use that sound, that music, and couldn't get the permissions. So I can't actually show it with the sound because I could get sued. But this is a print. This is whitewash privilege from start to finish in 2 minutes and 57 seconds. You can kind of see by the scale that the image is roughly 25 by 32 inches, I think. And then the paper is roughly 30 by 44. So layer number 2. And I always find it amazing after magenta and cyan that you can almost start seeing the semblance of yellow, and no yellow has been printed yet because the National Geographic magazine is so ubiquitous. So here's the first yellow, and there's, after 4 layers, a kind of wishy-washy version of the image. But now it's all the fun stuff. Let's make some red things redder. So those little red stripes down the side and at the bottom, just make them more intense. Let's make the yellow more yellow, but not everywhere. That stencil has now been reduced. So there's some of the original yellow, really pale, being left behind, just intensifying just the blue at the top. There's more. Now we're printing reds instead of magentas, but only in specific places. So the reds in the flag becoming more red. I think this image ended up having 8 or 9 layers of yellow just to make the yellow of the National Geographic magazine really resonant. And I have to say, I love to print. So printing multiple layers doesn't bother me at all. It's just a kick. So I really have embraced the idea that printing all these really subtle, transparent layers can yield something rich, and that it's just fun to do. We're getting close to the end. So I think we're probably around layer 14 there. This is, I think, the last layer, and it's hard to see, but it was really just to richen up the spaces in between some of the letters so that there would be more of a sense of transparency in layers. And you can't really see a huge change to the print, but you can see that from printing on the white piece of paper that there was a fair bit of stuff happened there. A final cleanup. Let's shut the camera off. So let's be a bit of a bonehead. And then there's the image. And again, there's some fantastic music playing over this. It's so goofy and funny. And I'm sorry that I can't show it to you because I couldn't get the permissions. Is that helpful at all? Yes, and responding to Gail, yes, that's the one thing about one of the benefits of, I mean, there's obviously the detriment of printing in a really dry environment. So we use UV ink to compensate for that. But in a really dry environment, my paper is always the same size. It barely changes. We're about 20%, 22% humidity all the time. Very rarely does it go up. And we have a bit of a rainy season in the spring, and then I really can't print then because the paper's in different, dramatically different sizes every day. But that's one of the benefits of printing in screen. Plus, you're registering face up. It's terrific. It's so much easier than trying to register face down on things. And I did print lithography for many years and was printing 15 or 20 layers on each of those prints as well. And I just got so frustrated with the constant struggle to register things accurately. People are doing it so well now compared to what was the knowledge that was available when I was a student. But I just really like the idea that in screen I can have a pretty good day and print 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 layers of color and really see the print evolve quickly. Again, not something that chromatically that printmaking tends to do all that well. And I like speed because it's I like a quick changeover of things as much as possible. Now I feel like I'm just rambling. So.
All right, well, thanks so much, Briar, and thanks everybody for joining us this evening. And I just want to let you know our last talk of this series is next Friday at 5 p.m. and it's Fruma Markowitz. So please join us for that as well.
Great. Well, thanks for everyone for coming, and thanks Jessica for setting all this stuff up, and for organizing the exhibition in the first place and owning the shop. It's yeah. Great. It's been fun.
It's been our pleasure. Thanks so much for joining in, and we'll have the link up on YouTube shortly, and fingers crossed. And yeah. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming.